In 1979, Iran was a completely different country. Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had modeled his military on the West: American instructors, American aircraft, American tanks. By the time he fled, Iranian armored forces ran more than 2,000 vehicles of exclusively Western origin: M47s, M48s, and M60s from the United States, and British Chieftains, among the finest tanks of their generation. The army was expensive, well-equipped, and entirely dependent on Western suppliers for spare parts and ammunition. That dependency, within a few years, would become a catastrophe. When Ayatollah Khomeini returned from 15 years of exile on February 1, 1979, the new government moved against the military fast. Officers who had served under the Shah were branded collaborators of a rotten regime. Within the first month after the revolution, 23 generals and 30 senior officials were executed. The purges kept rolling. Thousands of career officers, trained abroad, capable of maintaining Western hardware, ended up imprisoned, exiled, or shot. An army built over decades was gutted in months. Khomeini believed revolutionary spirit could substitute for professional training. Reality disagreed, and disagreed brutally. On November 4, 1979, radical students seized the American embassy in Tehran. Washington responded the same day. President Carter froze Iranian assets and imposed a full embargo. Military cooperation was finished. Spare parts for American tanks, aircraft engines, fire control electronics, all of it stopped arriving overnight. 2,000 Western-made machines began aging with no maintenance and no prospect of replacement. On September 22, 1980, Iraq crossed the Iranian border without bothering to declare war.
Saddam Hussein's math was simple. Iran's army was leaderless, its equipment was failing, its Western backers had walked away. Iraqi forces pushed in with roughly 100,000 troops, 1,600 tanks, and 2,000 armored vehicles. Iran could scrape together around 25,000 soldiers and 800 tanks, and about half of those sat immobile as static firing positions because there wasn't enough fuel or spare parts to actually move them. In January 1981, the war's largest tank engagement played out near the city of Dezful. Iranian armor tried to counterattack and push the Iraqis back, and drove straight into a prepared trap. In the marshlands around Susangerd, Iranian columns were forced onto roads, slow, strung out, flanks wide open. The Iraqis pulled them into a killing ground anchored by 3 armored brigades. Iran lost somewhere between 88 and over 200 tanks by various estimates, mostly the M60s and Chieftains bought under the Shah. And that's when the real problem became clear. There was nothing to replace them with. To rebuild its armored forces at all, Iran had to source Soviet vehicles through China, Libya, and Syria. It was a humiliating workaround. A country that had recently fielded the latest American hardware was now quietly buying second-hand Soviet tanks through back channels. By the time the war ended in 1988, Iran's tank fleet stood at around 1,500 vehicles, and at least half of them were now Soviet or Chinese in origin. The war cost both sides enormously. Combined casualties reached an estimated 1 million people. 8 years of bloodshed moved the borders exactly nowhere. But those 8 years left Iran with a question it would spend the next 3 decades trying to answer. How do you fight when nobody will sell you weapons? The answer was obvious. Build everything yourself. In 1984, the United States formally prohibited any country from selling arms to Iran. In 1995, Russia pulled out of military cooperation. Iran never received the 570 T-72s,
over 1,000 infantry fighting vehicles, and the air defense systems that had been agreed upon. UN Security Council resolutions in 2006 and 2010 locked the door on heavy offensive weapons entirely. Iran was boxed in. That's when the Code Kifayi program, self-sufficiency, took shape. The logic was blunt. If the world won't sell, we'll manufacture. Tanks, missiles, aircraft, drones, all of it, with our own hands from what we have. It sounded bold. Engineers started with the most obvious target, the tank. A country still running American M47s and M48s from the 1950s, alongside a mismatched collection of Soviet machines bought through intermediaries, needed something it could call its own. Something to roll out on parade and say, "This is our answer to the West. This is our independence. This is our steel." What came out of that program exceeded all expectations, just not in the way Tehran had planned.
The tank got a noble name, Zulfiqar, after the legendary sword of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the first Imam of Shia Islam. The name promised strength and invincibility. What followed was considerably more modest. Development was handed to Brigadier General Mir Yunus Masremzadeh, Deputy Commander of the Ground Forces for Science and Research. The mission was straightforward: build a main battle tank that would free Iran from dependence on foreign armor suppliers for good. Ambitious on paper, but when engineers actually got to work, an uncomfortable truth surfaced. Iran had almost no homegrown technology capable of producing a modern tank. So they took the only road available, borrowing from others and stitching it into something they could call their own. The Zulfiqar prototype was finished in 1993 and shown publicly in 1994. The design was an unabashed hybrid. Hull and running gear came from American M48s and M60s. Iran still had plenty left over from the Shah's era. The transmission was a local copy of the American SPAT-1200 unit used on the M60. The main gun was the Soviet 125mm smoothbore 2A46, pulled straight from the T-72. The turret was a welded Iranian design. The fire control system, the EFCS-3, came from Slovenia. The engine, rated at 780 horsepower, was Soviet, again from the T-72. One analyst nailed it in a single line: "I built it from whatever I had lying around." But the real story wasn't in the blueprints. It was in what happened when they tried to build the thing at scale. In April 1997, Iran's ground forces commander stood up and announced the start of mass production. In July, President Hashemi Rafsanjani personally cut the ribbon on the new assembly line at the Shahid Koladuz plant in Tehran. The ceremony was elaborate, the speeches were loud, the promises were big. The actual output rate made a mockery of the word mass. The plant was producing around 20 tanks a year. For comparison, during the Second World War, Soviet factories were turning out that many vehicles every few hours. The reasons weren't hard to find. Iran couldn't produce enough quality armor steel. Electronics for the fire control systems were sourced abroad, often routed through third countries to get around sanctions. Key engine components were imported too, even as official statements insisted everything was made domestically. Whenever sanctions tightened, supply chains snapped and the line went cold. A country that had proclaimed full self-sufficiency was, in practice, dependent on dozens of foreign parts it had to smuggle in. Over the following years, Iranian engineers kept trying to improve the design. The Zulfiqar II appeared, then the Zulfiqar III. The third variant brought a 7-road wheel suspension replacing the original 6, a redesigned turret that visually echoed the American Abrams, an engine bumped up to 1,000 horsepower, and an updated fire control package.
At the parade marking the revolution's anniversary in January 2013, the Zulfiqar III made a real impression. It genuinely looked like progress. The production numbers told a different story. From the start of manufacturing in 1996 through the end of the 2000s, Iran built, depending on the source, somewhere between 150 and 250 Zulfiqars across all variants. Over more than 20 years. A country with a multi-million-strong army and regional power ambitions had produced fewer tanks than a Soviet wartime factory turned out in a single month.
That was the core lesson of the Zulfiqar. Declaring independence is the easy part. Actually delivering it is something else. The program wasn't a total loss, though. More than 200 engineers and tankers trained in Russia. Designers picked up real hands-on experience with Soviet-era components. The Bani Hashim plant in Loristan province, built with Russian help, gradually developed actual manufacturing competence. By the mid-2000s, Tehran decided it was time to move past iterating on an aging hybrid and build something it could stand behind. A modern tank that could sit next to a Russian T-90 or an American Abrams without looking out of place. A machine that would show the world Iran could build weapons. They called it Karrar, the striker. And that's where the real story starts. The Bani Hashim plant sits in Loristan province, in the mountains of central Iran, outside the city of Dorud. It was built in the 1990s with Russian technical help. The original plan was to assemble licensed T-72s from Russian knockdown kits delivered to the site. That plan died in 1995 when the Gore-Chernomyrdin agreement pulled Russia out of military cooperation with Tehran. The facility was downgraded to a repair shop and spent the next decade patching up aging equipment. Then, Iranian engineers decided to give it a second life. This was where Iran's next tank, the one the country intended to show the world, would come together. The first footage of Karrar surfaced in August 2016 on Iranian state television, showing the vehicle running trials in the desert. The international expert community took one look and reached the same conclusion. This tank looks like a Russian T-90. Same characteristic multifaceted welded turret, same hull proportions, same explosive reactive armor blocks across the frontal arc. Iran's official response came quickly. Karrar was described as a fully independent design, drawing only loosely on certain Russian concepts. A characteristically Iranian formulation. Don't deny the obvious, but don't admit to copying either. The actual story was simpler. The Karrars chassis is a deep rework of the Soviet T-72, of which Iran had retained significant numbers from pre-revolutionary deliveries and later back-channel purchases. The turret is new, welded, multifaceted, structurally close to the T-90's design. The main gun is the 125mm smoothbore 2A46, the same weapon on Russian tanks, fed by an autoloader. Crew of 3, driver, gunner, commander. Combat weight around 51 tons. Length with the gun forward, 9.5 meters. On paper, all of that sounds serious. The details are where it gets interesting. The gunner's primary site was reportedly supplied by the Slovenian firm Fotona, the same company that had been fitting optics to Iran's T-72 fleet for years. Satellite navigation, a digital instrument panel, and observation cameras were on board. A hunter-killer setup let the commander independently acquire a target. The turret would automatically swing to that bearing, and the gunner would finish the job. The ammunition load included gun-launched anti-tank guided missiles. Explosive reactive armor covered the hull and turret frontally. Slat armor screens protected the flanks against shaped charges.
Developers claimed the turret's combined frontal protection could reach the equivalent of 1,100 to 1,200 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel. Top road speed, 70 kilometers per hour. Range, 550 kilometers. On March 12, 2017, Tehran held the official unveiling. Military brass, journalists, and government officials gathered at the Defense Industries Organization compound. Defense Minister Brigadier General Hossein Dehan was there in person. His remarks read like a military manifesto. Karrar carried the most advanced equipment available, could engage stationary and moving targets around the clock, handle any terrain, and ford rivers underwater. Then, Ground Forces Commander Ahmad Reza Purdistan said something nobody in the room had seen coming. He claimed Iran's new tank was the equal of the Russian T-90, a vehicle that had recently proven itself in Syria. That was a loaded statement.
Russia had spent years blocking Iran from buying the T-90, specifically because of international sanctions. And here was an Iranian general at a podium saying his country had independently built something just as capable. At the same session, serial production at Bani Hashim was declared open. Cameras panned across a workshop floor showing multiple hull assemblies at various stages of completion. Wire services picked up the story and ran it worldwide. Iran had announced the birth of its own modern tank. The ceremony was polished, the speeches landed, the factory was real. Just one question was left hanging in the air. How many of these tanks would actually get built? The March 2017 fanfare sent headlines around the world. Iran's state agencies Fars and Tasnim couldn't contain themselves. Defense Minister Degan called it a breakthrough. The ground forces commander put Karrar in the same sentence as the T-90. Bani Hashim was crowned the centerpiece of a new Iranian tank-building industry. For a moment, it looked like history had finally broken Tehran's way. Behind all of it, though, were facts nobody was rushing to share. The first was about the plant itself. Bani Hashim had been built in the 90s to assemble licensed T-72s from Russian knockdown kits. When Moscow walked away in 1995, it became a repair shop and stayed that way for nearly 2 decades. Full-cycle tank manufacturing had never existed there. Iran had genuinely figured out certain things along the way: domestic copies of Slovenian fire control systems, thermal imaging sites built around Chinese detector arrays, armor-piercing fin-stabilized rounds. But, as military analysts were happy to point out, none of that added up to a credible industrial base for building heavy armor from scratch. The second fact was about numbers. Iranian military officials had a particular gift for figures. They threw them out generously, confidently, and never followed up. In July 2018, about a year after the triumphant unveiling, a new order was announced. 800 Karrar tanks for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. 800 vehicles. That's a full rearmament program. Take a guess what happened next. Ground Forces Commander Brigadier General Karrars Haidari assured journalists that deliveries were right around the corner. A year went by. Then another. Then a third. Karrar kept showing up at parades, exactly where it had always been. A handful of immaculate vehicles, freshly polished, parked squarely in front of the cameras. Individual machines trickled into military units, mostly for training. The kind of serial production that officials had described so confidently never showed up in any form that outside observers could verify. The problem was structural, and anyone who'd watched the Zulfiqar program 2 decades earlier would have recognized it immediately. In 2018, the Trump administration pulled out of the nuclear deal and snapped sanctions back into place.
The rial cratered. Annual inflation shot into triple digits. Iran's defense budget, per Stockholm International Peace Research Institute data, came in at roughly $13 billion in 2018. Serious money for the region, but nowhere near enough for a country simultaneously bankrolling a ballistic missile program, a drone industry, a naval buildup, and an ostensible commitment to producing hundreds of modern tanks. Something had to give. To be fair, Iranian industry wasn't standing still. Bani Hashim was genuinely converting existing T-72s, fitting them with new turrets built to Karrar specification. These vehicles were designated T-72F. It was a reasonable workaround. Instead of building new tanks from the ground up, turn the old ones into something that at least resembled a contemporary design. But even here, the pace was hard to defend. The defense minister, touring the plant, expressed hope that the entire existing fleet could eventually be modernized, a carefully hedged line that said everything about how far reality had drifted from the original promises.
And yet Iran's official inventory still listed 540 T-54s and T-55s, vehicles drawn up in the late 1940s. 168 M47s, an American design that Washington itself retired in the 1970s. 150 M60s, Cold War machines that Iranian crews had been nursing along for nearly half a century, periodically strapping on extra armor panels and calling it an upgrade. 100 British chieftains. All of this sitting on the books of an army that had just announced serial production of a tank equal to the T-90 and the Abrams. The gap was wide enough that missing it required genuine effort. Iran's formula never changed. Announce, celebrate, declare victory. Production figures were a detail, one nobody would be in a position to check. The Zulfiqar line had been opened by a sitting president in 1997. The Karrar line was opened by a defense minister in 2017. Both times the language was identical. Independence, breakthrough, enemies forced to take notice. Both times the real numbers stayed classified, presumably because the truth made for a much worse speech than the one delivered from the podium. Let's take stock. By 2024, Iran's tank inventory sits at around 1,600 vehicles. That number sounds serious, especially if you say it with enough confidence at a military parade. But look at what's actually in that inventory, and the impression falls apart fast. 540 of those tanks are T-54s and T-55s, vehicles drafted in the late 1940s. Tanks that fought in Korea, Vietnam, the Arab-Israeli wars. Machines that are between 50 and 70 years old today. Half of Iran's armored fleet is made up of mobile museum pieces that the army simply can't bring itself to retire because there's nothing to put in their place. 168 M47s, an American design from the early 1950s, that the United States itself put out to pasture decades ago. 150 M60, machines Iranian crews have been keeping alive for nearly half a century, periodically bolting on extra armor and calling it an upgrade. 100 British chieftains, tanks that London walked away from in the 1980s. 75 T-62s, a Soviet design that was already losing relevance by the time it left production. Against that backdrop, the 250 Zulfiqars almost look cutting edge. Almost. Because the Zulfiqar, for all its claims to originality, is a mashup of engineering solutions from the 1970s and 1980s bolted together in the 1990s. Not a bad machine for its moment. That moment is gone. And then there's Karrar, the tank this entire video was built around. How many Karrars are actually standing in formation in the Iranian army right now? Nobody knows. Iran doesn't publish that number.
Western analysts put it at a few dozen operational vehicles, maybe just over 100 if you count the T-72s refitted with Karrar-type turrets.
Of the 800 units ordered for the Revolutionary Guard, nothing close to that figure has been delivered. The parade happened. The speeches happened. The tanks did not. Which brings us to the question that actually matters. If Iran gets pulled into a full-scale ground war, not drone strikes, not missile barrages, not proxy forces operating on foreign soil, but a real armored fight, boots and tracks on the ground, what happens to this army? The answer is uncomfortable for Tehran, and obvious to anyone who studies this stuff. T-54s and M-47s going up against modern armor aren't combatants. They're targets. No thermal imaging that works at real engagement ranges after dark. No reactive armor that stops contemporary shaped charge rounds. No active protection systems. The crew of one of those tanks in a modern engagement is as good as dead before they've even found the enemy. Zulfiqar and Karrar are a different story, but only up to a point. Yes, the Photona sights give them a real edge over the antiques in their own fleet. Yes, a 125mm gun commands respect, but modern armored warfare isn't a gun duel. It's situational awareness, encrypted comms, integration with air assets and drones, and active protection. Karrar doesn't have any of that at the level its likely adversaries do. And those adversaries are specific. Israel fields the Merkava Mark IV with the Trophy active protection system. It swats incoming anti-tank missiles out of the air before they hit. The United States keeps M1A2s in the region with thermal optics and their own active protection suites. Saudi Arabia has picked up several hundred Leopard 2s and M1A2s. Next to any of these, Karrar isn't a peer. It's a younger but still outgunned contender. This is exactly why Iranian military doctrine quietly stopped being built around an armored spearhead a long time ago. Tehran went a different direction. Ballistic missiles that can reach Tel Aviv or American bases across the Gulf. A drone fleet, the Shahed series, which has been flying combat missions in Ukraine for 2 years, and which Iran pushes out to proxy forces across the Middle East. Asymmetric options. Hundreds of fast attack craft in the Strait of Hormuz, capable of choking off a third of global oil transit. Anything, really, as long as it doesn't mean rolling tanks onto a battlefield. That's not weakness in any straightforward sense. It's a cold-eyed calculation, and it's also the answer to the question at the heart of this video. Can Karrar win in a straight fight? On a test range, one-on-one, maybe. A 125mm gun, gun-launched guided missiles, a thermal sight, that's real hardware, not a prop. But war isn't a duel. It's logistics, communications, air cover, and the number of vehicles actually in the field rather than on a parade route. On every single one of those counts, Karrar comes up short. Israel brings Merkava with Trophy. It kills the missile before it arrives. The United States brings M1A2s with thermals that spot Karrar at night before its crew has any idea they're being watched. First shot wins. That's the rule of modern tank combat, and under that rule, Karrar has no edge. And the deeper problem is just the numbers. A few dozen vehicles, maybe 100, counting the refitted T-72s. That's not an armored fist. That's a company. One company doesn't win wars. The other 1,500 Iranian tanks, the T-54s, the M-47s, the Chieftains, aren't backup. They're dead weight, slow, blind, and killable by practically any modern anti-armor system in the field. Karrar is a genuine achievement for a country that built it in isolation. It's also proof that isolation kills armies more surely than any enemy.
It wasn't built to win battles. It was built to win parades, to give the country something to show, to make adversaries think twice, to give the Iranian public something to believe in. Here's the detail I promised at the start. Next time you watch an Iranian military parade and see a column of Karrars rolling past the stands, remember one simple thing. There's a good chance those exact vehicles were in the last parade, and the one before that, because new ones are barely coming off the line. Iran keeps showing the same hardware year after year and calling it serial production. An army built for the camera. A country that has mastered the art of making weapons for an audience. If this video gave you something new, hit like. It's the best way to let me know. Subscribe if you're not already. There are plenty more stories ahead about hardware that was promised and never delivered. And leave a comment. Do you think Karrar ever sees a real battlefield? I want to know what you think.